In the summer of the 1940s, thousands of German soldiers, men who had once marched proudly under the banners of the Third Reich, found themselves crossing the Atlantic Ocean, not as conquerors, but as captives. They were prisoners of war, captured on the battlefields of North Africa and Europe, now being shipped to an unfamiliar land, the United States of America. For many, this journey was filled with fear and uncertainty. They had been told by Nazi propaganda that America was a brutal, decaying society, a land ruled by greedy capitalists where life was cheap and prisoners were treated like animals. As their ships approached American ports, they braced themselves for the worst. The first shock came not in the camps, but at the docks. Instead of angry mobs or cruel guards, they were met with order and calm. American military police stood firm but not violent. The prisoners were marched in neat columns, given water, and transported with surprising efficiency. The contrast to their expectations was immediate. They had prepared themselves for beatings, insults, and starvation, yet what awaited them was something far more bewildering: dignity. When they arrived at the prisoner-of-war camps scattered across the Midwest, the South, and the plains of Texas, another wave of astonishment washed over them. Behind the barbed wire fences stood not filthy shacks or brutal workyards, but rows of wooden barracks, clean, spacious, and even heated in the winter. Each camp had running water, kitchens, medical facilities, and recreational areas. For soldiers who had marched through the ruined cities of Europe, or survived on the meager rations of the Wehrmacht, it was almost unthinkable. The food, perhaps more than anything else, left them stunned. Meals were regular, plentiful, and balanced: meat, bread, vegetables, milk. To men accustomed to shortages back home, it felt like luxury. Some even wrote letters to their families in Germany, describing meals that seemed more fitting for guests than for captives. Of course, these letters were censored, but enough hints slipped through to create disbelief back in Europe. The irony was painful: the prisoners were often eating better in captivity than their families in the Reich. Daily life in the camps followed a structure that was strict, but not cruel. Roll calls, assigned duties, and curfews gave the camps a military rhythm, yet there was space for humanity. Prisoners were allowed to organize their own theater performances, sports matches, and even orchestras. Many remembered that first evening when, instead of punishment or humiliation, they were invited to watch a film or listen to a concert performed by fellow prisoners. It was a small thing, but it carried enormous weight. It signaled that they were not going to be broken down, they were going to be treated as men. This treatment was not accidental. The United States was determined to follow the Geneva Convention, not only out of principle, but also as a way to demonstrate the strength of democracy. By treating their enemies humanely, America sought to undermine Nazi propaganda. It was a strategy of quiet persuasion, and it worked more effectively than any weapon. The prisoners began to whisper among themselves: if this was how America treated its enemies, perhaps much of what they had been told about the outside world was a lie. For some prisoners, this realization came slowly. They were cautious, waiting for the cruelty to reveal itself. Yet weeks passed, then months, and the brutality never came. Guards were strict, yes, but not vicious. Infractions were punished fairly, and order was maintained without unnecessary violence. To men who had lived under the Gestapo's shadow, the difference was stark. Here, there was no fear of disappearing in the night, no terror of arbitrary punishment. It was in these early days of captivity that the first cracks began to appear in the worldview of the German POWs. They had entered America expecting to find monsters, and instead found a society that, even in wartime, valued fairness and humanity. For many, it was deeply unsettling. Everything they had been taught about democracy being weak, chaotic, and cruel now stood in question. The journey from soldier to prisoner is never easy. It strips a man of pride, of identity, and of certainty. Yet for these German soldiers, their arrival in America marked the beginning of something unexpected: not just captivity, but transformation. Within the fences of those camps, surrounded by guards and barbed wire, they encountered a different kind of battlefield, one fought not with guns and tanks, but with ideas, values, and simple acts of humanity. Their war was over, but a new struggle had begun, the struggle between the world they had believed in, and the world they were now seeing with their own eyes. And it all started the moment they set foot on American soil. For the German prisoners of war, the first days inside the American camps were filled with moments of disbelief. They had expected cold barracks, thin rations, and constant reminders of defeat. Instead, they were confronted with a reality so far removed from their expectations that many could not process it immediately. What struck them most, beyond the humane treatment and orderliness, was the sheer abundance of resources. Everywhere they looked, America seemed to overflow with food and supplies. The kitchens inside the camps were stocked with items they had not seen in years. Potatoes, bread, cheese, milk, meat, and vegetables appeared on the tables with regularity. To men who had grown used to shortages, ration cards, and watered-down soup back home, this was nothing short of astonishing. Some prisoners whispered among themselves that it was all a trick, that the Americans were showing them plenty for now, but would later cut back. Yet days turned into weeks, and the abundance never stopped. For men raised on Nazi propaganda, this sight was deeply unsettling. They had been told since childhood that America was weak, decadent, and incapable of sustaining itself in a long war. German radio broadcasts often painted a picture of Americans as soft and wasteful, incapable of discipline or sacrifice. And yet, here in front of their own eyes, was a system so efficient and so overflowing with resources that it defied every story they had been told. The contrast with war-torn Germany was impossible to ignore. Back in the Reich, cities lay in ruins from bombing campaigns. Families struggled daily with shortages. Even soldiers at the front were often hungry, surviving on meager rations. Here, in the very land they had been taught to despise, prisoners were being fed better than their own families back home. Some men felt a pang of guilt when writing censored letters to their loved ones. They dared not describe the full truth, but even subtle hints, that they were eating well, that they were healthy, were enough to shock families who could barely find bread in bombed-out towns. The abundance went beyond just food. The camps were supplied with medical equipment, clothing, books, and recreational materials. Prisoners noticed that nothing seemed to run out. Soap, paper, tools, all the small things that had become scarce in Germany, were readily available here. To many POWs, this was as jarring as the meals themselves. It revealed not just America's wealth, but its ability to organize and distribute resources on a massive scale. Work assignments further reinforced this impression. Prisoners who labored on American farms saw endless fields of crops stretching to the horizon. The productivity was staggering. A single American farm seemed capable of feeding hundreds, even thousands of people. In Germany, by contrast, years of war and shortages had crippled agriculture. Now, these soldiers, who had once imagined themselves as superior conquerors, were working in a land that produced food with an ease and abundance that seemed almost magical. In factories, too, the POWs saw something that shook their confidence in everything they had been told. Assembly lines ran smoothly, workers were efficient, and supplies never seemed to dry up. There was none of the desperation that marked German industry in the later years of the war, no shortages of fuel or steel, no desperate patchwork solutions. Instead, there was order, method, and output on a scale that dwarfed anything in the Reich. Some prisoners began to quietly discuss these discoveries among themselves. The propaganda of the Third Reich had portrayed Germany as the peak of efficiency and America as a land of chaos. Yet reality told a different story. Here, in this so-called decadent democracy, things simply worked, and worked better than in their own homeland. For many POWs, this realization was more unsettling than captivity itself. Losing the war was one thing, discovering that much of what they had been taught was false was another. Each overflowing warehouse, each full plate of food, each well-organized farm or factory served as living proof that their worldview was cracking. The shock of abundance was not only material, it was psychological. These soldiers had been indoctrinated to believe that strength came from control, scarcity, and sacrifice. Yet here they saw a society that combined freedom with prosperity, democracy with discipline. It forced them to reconsider ideas they had once taken for granted. By the end of their first months in America, many prisoners had quietly admitted to themselves what they could not yet say aloud: the Reich had lied to them. America was not weak. It was powerful in ways they had never imagined, not only in its military might, but in its ability to provide for its people, even for its enemies. The discovery was both humbling and unsettling. For these men, sitting behind barbed wire with full stomachs, the war was no longer just about weapons and battles. It had become a clash of systems, a test of which society could endure and thrive. And in that test, America's abundance spoke louder than any speech or weapon. As the months of captivity stretched on, the American authorities introduced another element that would profoundly shape the experiences of German prisoners of war: work programs. At first, many of the captured soldiers assumed their lives would be confined to barracks and barbed wire. They expected idleness, boredom, and perhaps forced labor under cruel conditions. Instead, the U.S. government made a calculated decision: POWs would be integrated into the American workforce, not as slaves, but as organized laborers contributing to civilian needs under the rules of the Geneva Convention. Prisoners were soon dispatched to agricultural and industrial sites across the country. For many, their first assignments were on farms that stretched farther than the eye could see. Vast fields of wheat, corn, and cotton rolled endlessly across the horizon. German soldiers, who had grown accustomed to shortages and rationing, were stunned by the scale of American agriculture. A single farm seemed to produce more than an entire village back home. Working under the open sky, they saw tractors plowing with ease, machines harvesting crops in record time, and barns filled to bursting. The efficiency was unlike anything they had ever experienced in Europe. It was not just the abundance that left an impression, but the freedom of those around them. American farmers worked hard, but they carried themselves with an independence that was unfamiliar to the German soldiers. There was no presence of secret police, no party officials watching from the shadows, no fear of punishment for speaking one's mind. Men and women moved about their lives confidently, knowing they were free to criticize the government, to read what they wished, and to worship how they pleased. For POWs who had spent their lives under the suffocating reach of Nazi ideology, this was a revelation. Factories offered a similar shock. In industrial plants, prisoners watched as assembly lines churned out equipment, tools, and supplies at a speed that was breathtaking. Workers operated with discipline but without fear. They joked, they argued, they moved about freely, and yet the work was done with precision and output that dwarfed the Reich's struggling war industries. The German POWs had been told repeatedly that democracies were inefficient and chaotic, unable to mobilize in the face of conflict. Yet here, in front of their very eyes, was living proof of the opposite. Many of the prisoners began to talk among themselves during breaks, quietly comparing what they saw in America with what they remembered back home. They recalled propaganda posters showing America as a land of corruption and poverty. But what they were witnessing was a society where even common laborers had access to steady wages, decent food, and personal freedoms. The sharp contrast was impossible to ignore. Over time, the work programs also softened the relationship between captors and captives. American civilians, though cautious at first, often treated the POWs with a surprising degree of fairness. Some shared food or drinks, others struck up conversations despite the language barrier. While there was no illusion that the Germans were anything other than enemy soldiers, the humanity extended to them was undeniable. For many POWs, this was the first time they had encountered Americans face-to-face outside of combat, and the experience was profoundly disarming. The U.S. government had a practical reason for implementing these programs. With so many American men away fighting overseas, there was a labor shortage at home. POWs filled this gap, keeping farms running and industries productive. But the unintended consequence was that thousands of German soldiers were now directly exposed to American life, not through propaganda, but through lived experience. And each day on the farm or in the factory chipped away at the carefully constructed lies they had been told in Germany. Some prisoners resisted these realizations. They clung stubbornly to Nazi ideology, convincing themselves that what they saw was only temporary or superficial. But for many others, the evidence was too overwhelming. The abundance, the efficiency, the freedom, these were not illusions. They were truths that contradicted the Reich's narrative. Even small moments carried great weight. A farmer laughing with his family at dinner, a worker casually criticizing the government without fear, a newspaper openly printing opinions, all these details gnawed at the worldview the POWs had once accepted as unquestionable. Slowly, silently, cracks widened in the mental walls built by years of propaganda. By the time months had passed, a subtle transformation was underway. German soldiers who had once viewed America with hatred and contempt now saw a society that was not only surviving the war, but thriving. Their work assignments had become classrooms, and every field, every factory floor was a lesson in the strength of democracy. For the U.S., this was a quiet but powerful victory. By exposing the prisoners to the daily reality of American life, they were planting seeds of doubt in the minds of men who had once pledged loyalty to the Reich. Those seeds would continue to grow, reshaping not only their views of the war, but their understanding of freedom itself. Life inside the American POW camps was not only about food, shelter, and work. For many German prisoners, the most surprising and transformative experiences came through exposure to American culture. What they saw, heard, and read during these months and years behind barbed wire opened doors to a world they had never truly imagined. It was not simply survival, it was an education in a new way of life. The camps were not designed to be bleak cages of silence. Instead, there were organized activities, opportunities for reading, and even forms of entertainment. At first, many prisoners approached these offerings with suspicion. They were wary that the Americans might use cultural events as tools of manipulation or propaganda. Yet over time, they realized something remarkable: the access they were being given was genuine, open, and strikingly different from what they had known in Germany. Movies became one of the most powerful windows into American society. The U.S. military regularly arranged film screenings inside the camps, projecting Hollywood productions onto makeshift screens. For young German soldiers who had grown up with heavily censored Nazi films, these movies were both thrilling and confusing. They were used to seeing only carefully controlled stories, films glorifying the Reich, demonizing enemies, or presenting rigid ideals of German strength. But the American films were different. They showed humor, romance, family struggles, and the everyday lives of ordinary people. Characters spoke freely, women played independent roles, and stories ended not always with triumph, but often with lessons about resilience, kindness, or hope. For many prisoners, this was their first real exposure to the idea that cinema could be more than propaganda, it could be art, entertainment, and even a reflection of democratic values. After a screening, groups of POWs would often discuss the films late into the night, debating characters, themes, and moral choices. These conversations were more than idle chatter, they were small steps toward questioning the narrow worldview they had carried from Germany. Books, too, played a central role. The camp libraries were stocked with a variety of literature, novels, history, philosophy, and even newspapers. Unlike in the Reich, where access to books was tightly monitored and censorship was ever present, here the prisoners found themselves free to read widely. Some chose light reading to pass the time, but others devoured works of American and European thinkers, many of whom had been banned or restricted back home. For the first time, they encountered ideas about democracy, free speech, and individual rights without the filter of Nazi ideology. The impact of this intellectual freedom was profound. A soldier who had once memorized the slogans of the Reich might now spend evenings wrestling with the writings of philosophers who questioned authoritarianism. Another who had never known a press free from state control might find himself reading editorials that openly criticized American leaders, something unimaginable in Hitler's Germany. Each book, each article, was a spark against the darkness of propaganda. Cultural events organized within the camps added yet another dimension. Music concerts, theater performances, and lectures were arranged, sometimes by the American authorities, sometimes by the prisoners themselves. German musicians among the POWs formed orchestras, playing not only their own classical traditions but also American jazz, which had been condemned as degenerate by the Nazis. Hearing jazz played openly, with guards and prisoners alike tapping their feet, was a revelation. It was living proof that what had been forbidden at home was celebrated here. Theater performances often explored themes of freedom, identity, and survival. Some were light comedies meant to ease the tension of captivity, while others tackled deeper questions. The very act of creating and performing, without fear of censorship or reprisal, became a form of liberation for the prisoners. For many, this was the first time they experienced what it meant to speak and act without constant surveillance from political authorities. All of these cultural encounters, movies, books, music, theater, worked quietly but powerfully to reshape the prisoners' perspectives. At first, many resisted. They told themselves that these freedoms were superficial, that democracy was still weak at its core. But with each passing week, the evidence mounted. The openness of American culture was not an illusion. It was real, and it was consistent. The most striking difference, perhaps, was the absence of fear. In Germany, every book read, every song played, every opinion voiced carried risk. Here, even as captives, the Germans were being allowed to experience a society where ideas competed freely, where culture thrived without government control. It was democracy not as an abstract theory, but as a daily reality, played out in films, in libraries, in music halls, and in conversations around campfires. For some prisoners, these encounters were nothing more than passing diversions, a way to fill long hours of captivity. But for others, they were life-changing. Slowly, silently, they began to imagine a world where freedom of thought and expression was not dangerous, but natural. And in doing so, they took their first steps toward leaving behind the shadows of totalitarianism. By the time they returned to Germany after the war, many would carry with them memories not of battles fought, but of ideas discovered, memories of nights spent watching a Hollywood film, afternoons lost in the pages of a banned book, or evenings filled with the sound of jazz drifting across the camp. These were more than entertainments, they were lessons in freedom. For the German prisoners of war, life in American camps was filled with constant surprises. Yet nothing struck them as deeply as what happened during the Christmas season. Many had entered captivity expecting hostility, humiliation, or cold indifference. Instead, during the holidays, they encountered something entirely different: warmth, generosity, and even celebration. What unfolded in December of those years behind the barbed wire became one of the most powerful awakenings of their captivity. The preparations began weeks in advance. Guards and camp officials arranged decorations, evergreen branches, handmade ornaments, and strings of lights. Choirs were formed, not only from among the prisoners but also sometimes joined by Americans themselves. For German soldiers who had expected to be treated as hated enemies, the sight of their captors working to create a festive atmosphere was almost incomprehensible. Christmas was, after all, a deeply rooted tradition in Germany. To find it honored here, in a foreign land, by those they had been taught to despise, was shocking. On Christmas Eve, the atmosphere inside the camps changed completely. Barracks were lit softly, choirs began singing carols, and the sound of familiar melodies drifted across the compound. Songs like Still Nacht and O Tannenbaum carried the prisoners back to memories of home, families gathered around fireplaces, mothers preparing meals, children laughing with excitement. For many, these memories were painful reminders of what they had lost. Yet at the same time, the celebrations inside the camp gave them a sense of comfort they had never expected to find in enemy territory. American guards did not treat the event as a threat or as a moment to enforce strict rules. Instead, they gave the prisoners space to celebrate. Food rations were often improved for the holiday. Some camps even provided small gifts, donated by local charities, churches, or Red Cross organizations. For soldiers who had been hardened by years of propaganda telling them that Americans were brutal and inhuman, such gestures were profoundly unsettling. It was kindness where they had expected cruelty. The most moving moments often came when American choirs and German choirs sang together. Voices in two languages blended across the wire, united in melodies that spoke of peace, hope, and renewal. For prisoners who had marched under banners of hate, hearing such harmony was disarming. Some wept quietly, unable to reconcile the generosity they were experiencing with the image of America they had carried in their minds. For the first time, many of them began to see their captors not as faceless enemies, but as human beings. They realized that Americans shared the same traditions of family, faith, and festivity. The divide between us and them seemed smaller in those moments. Instead of cold suspicion, there was warmth. Instead of propaganda slogans, there was music. Perhaps the most powerful impact of the Christmas celebrations was the sense of dignity the prisoners felt. Despite being captives, they were allowed to honor their faith and traditions openly. In Nazi Germany, Christmas itself had been politicized, reshaped to serve the ideology of the state. Here, in captivity, they were free to celebrate without censorship. For many, this freedom was even more shocking than the abundance of food or the generosity of gifts. It was a reminder that dignity could exist even in defeat. The Christmas awakening was not only about nostalgia or sentiment. It was a revelation about America itself. The men realized that their captors were not consumed by hatred or vengeance. Instead, they were guided by principles of fairness, humanity, and respect, even toward enemies. This recognition began to dissolve the lies they had been told. The America they were experiencing was not weak, chaotic, or cruel. It was a land of opportunity, abundance, and, most surprisingly, compassion. Years later, many former prisoners would recall those Christmases in America as turning points. They remembered the carols, the lights, the laughter shared even across language barriers. They remembered the strange but beautiful feeling of being treated with kindness when they least expected it. These memories stayed with them long after the war ended, shaping how they viewed not only America, but also the meaning of humanity itself. For some, the Christmas celebrations planted the very first seeds of reconciliation. They began to imagine a future in which former enemies could coexist, not through force, but through shared values of dignity and respect. It was a radical thought for men who had once believed only in conquest and domination. Thus, the Christmas awakening was more than a holiday event. It was a profound cultural and emotional encounter that broke through barriers of hate and fear. It showed the prisoners that America was not a land of brutality, but a land where even enemies were treated with humanity. In the glow of candles and the sound of carols, they discovered a truth far greater than victory or defeat, that dignity, compassion, and freedom were stronger than propaganda, and that even in captivity, the human spirit could be renewed. By the middle years of the war, American authorities recognized that the German prisoners under their care were not only soldiers but also men shaped by years of propaganda. Many had been indoctrinated since childhood, exposed to Nazi ideology in schools, youth groups, and the military. Captivity provided an opportunity to break through that conditioning. Thus, in addition to food, work, and cultural exposure, the U.S. government introduced a remarkable initiative: educational and re-education programs inside the camps. At first, many prisoners were suspicious. They assumed that any instruction offered by their captors would simply be propaganda dressed as education. In Germany, lessons had been nothing more than ideological drills, filled with slogans and distorted facts. But to their surprise, the programs in American camps were entirely different. Instead of forcing them to memorize slogans, the courses opened doors to knowledge. They were structured not to manipulate but to educate, allowing prisoners to see and think for themselves. Classes were offered in a wide range of subjects: history, literature, politics, philosophy, and economics. For men who had been trained to follow orders without question, the idea of openly discussing such topics was revolutionary. American educators, many of them civilian volunteers or professors, approached the prisoners as students rather than enemies. They encouraged questions, debates, and even disagreements. One of the most striking aspects of these lessons was the way history was presented. In Nazi Germany, history had been rewritten to glorify the Reich and erase inconvenient truths. Here, for the first time, the prisoners were exposed to accounts that contradicted what they had been taught. They learned about the brutality of the Nazi regime, the persecution of minorities, and the realities of the war beyond the official German narrative. These revelations were not easy to accept. Some resisted, dismissing the lessons as enemy lies. But others began to feel cracks forming in the worldview they had once believed unshakable. Economics classes were equally eye-opening. Prisoners studied the workings of the American economy, its scale, efficiency, and reliance on free enterprise. They compared it to the struggling, state-controlled system back home and could not ignore the results. While Germany rationed every resource and fought to keep its industries alive, America was producing abundance not only for itself but also for its allies. Through lectures and discussions, many POWs came to see that the propaganda portraying America as weak and decaying had been false. Instead, its strength lay in innovation, freedom, and the ability of individuals to thrive without fear of government control. Equally transformative were the political discussions. The prisoners encountered ideas about democracy, civil rights, and constitutional government, concepts often dismissed or caricatured in Nazi Germany. In class, they could ask questions without fear of punishment, something unimaginable back home. They debated whether democracy could truly function in practice, whether freedom led to chaos, or whether authority was always necessary for order. Slowly, they came to realize that the American system, however imperfect, offered a model of governance built on accountability and participation rather than coercion. Not every prisoner was immediately convinced. For some, the process of unlearning years of indoctrination was painful. Pride and loyalty to their homeland made it difficult to accept truths that reflected badly on the Germany they had fought for. Yet the very fact that such debates could take place at all marked a significant departure from the rigid control of ideas under the Nazis. Education was no longer a weapon of the state, it was a tool of discovery. Beyond formal classes, the re-education programs also included access to newspapers, magazines, and libraries filled with uncensored material. Reading assignments encouraged prisoners to engage with multiple perspectives, even those critical of America itself. This, perhaps more than anything else, convinced them that what they were being offered was not propaganda. After all, if the Americans were trying to brainwash them, why would they provide books that criticized their own government? The openness was in itself a lesson in democratic values. Some prisoners took these opportunities more seriously than others. A few immersed themselves in study, preparing for futures beyond the war. They began to imagine themselves as teachers, writers, or even reformers in post-war Germany. Others remained indifferent, treating the classes as a way to pass time rather than as a path to transformation. But for many, the seeds planted during these lessons grew quietly, reshaping their understanding of truth, freedom, and responsibility. Years later, historians would note how these educational initiatives had long-lasting effects. When the war ended and the prisoners returned home, some carried with them not only memories of humane treatment but also new ideas about democracy and society. A number of them would go on to become leaders in rebuilding a democratic Germany, drawing directly on what they had learned during captivity. Thus, the education and re-education programs were far more than camp activities. They were carefully designed bridges, from the closed, authoritarian world of Nazi Germany to the open, questioning spirit of democracy. For many prisoners, these bridges led to personal transformation. What began as suspicion turned into curiosity, and curiosity often grew into conviction. In classrooms behind barbed wire, men who had once marched under the swastika began to see another way of life, and, for the first time, to imagine a different kind of future as the war drew to a close and the years of captivity stretched on. A remarkable transformation began to unfold within the German prisoners of war held in America. What had started as small cracks in their worldview, first glimpsed through humane treatment, abundance, cultural freedom, and education, had by the end become deep shifts in their beliefs. By the time many of them were preparing to return home, they no longer saw America as a land of weakness or corruption, but as a society built on values that had challenged everything they once believed. For most, this transformation did not happen overnight. It was not a single moment of revelation but rather a gradual accumulation of experiences that slowly dismantled the framework of Nazi indoctrination. When they had first arrived, their hearts were hardened by years of propaganda. They saw Americans as greedy capitalists, decadent and divided, incapable of real strength. Yet reality inside the camps told a different story. Day by day, they lived in an environment that contradicted everything they had been taught. The abundance of food, the efficiency of industry, the freedom of culture, and the openness of debate, all of these left an impression that could not be ignored. At first, many prisoners resisted, clinging stubbornly to the worldview they had carried with them from Germany. But resistance gave way to doubt, and doubt gave way to reflection. Over time, reflection grew into conviction. One of the most powerful realizations for many prisoners was that strength did not have to come from oppression or fear. In Germany, they had been taught that unity could only be achieved through strict obedience and harsh control. But in America, they saw another kind of strength, the strength of diversity, of individuals free to express themselves, yet working together for a common good. Factories, farms, and communities thrived not because people were forced to obey, but because they were empowered to contribute. This was a lesson that stayed with many of them long after captivity ended. Fairness, too, was a revelation. Even as enemies, they were treated with a dignity they never expected. They were allowed to celebrate traditions, voice opinions, and pursue education. Instead of constant punishment, they found rules applied consistently and humanely. This sense of fairness, experienced even in captivity, shattered the image of America as a cruel oppressor. It showed them that justice was not just an ideal, it was a practice woven into daily life. For some, the most profound transformation was internal. They began to question not just Nazi ideology, but also their own role in supporting it. Confronted with new knowledge, about the lies of propaganda, about the atrocities committed in their name, they were forced to reckon with the past. Many wrestled with guilt, shame, and the difficult task of imagining a future no longer built on blind obedience. In quiet conversations at night, in camp discussions, or in personal reflections, they began to envision lives not as tools of a regime but as individuals capable of choice. By the end of their captivity, countless prisoners were no longer the men who had first marched into the camps. They left not only with new skills and knowledge but with a deeper appreciation for the values of freedom, abundance, and fairness. Some carried these lessons back to Germany and became active voices in rebuilding their homeland. Others simply carried them privately, shaping how they raised their families, how they worked, and how they remembered the war. Not every prisoner was transformed. There were those who remained loyal to the Reich to the very end, unwilling to abandon the beliefs that had defined their lives. But for a significant number, captivity in America marked the beginning of a lifelong shift away from totalitarianism. The seeds planted in those years grew into something larger, a recognition that another way of life was not only possible but also more just, more humane, and more enduring than the ideology they had once served. Historians would later point to these transformations as quiet but significant victories. While bombs and battles had defeated the German military, it was the experience of freedom, fairness, and human dignity that defeated the lies of Nazi propaganda in the hearts of many ordinary soldiers. This victory was less visible, but perhaps more lasting. It shaped not only the lives of the former prisoners but also the future of a post-war Germany searching for a new identity. In the end, the story of the German POWs in America was not just about captivity. It was about change. It was about men who arrived as enemies and left with a vision of a different kind of world. A world where strength came from freedom, where abundance was shared rather than hoarded, and where fairness replaced fear. This transformation of belief was the most enduring legacy of their time in America, one that would echo far beyond the fences of the camps, into the rebuilding of nations and the reawakening of hope after the darkest war in history.